Hello all and welcome, and I am the MGTOW philosopher. Now in this video I would like to discuss men, real men, the men of the past, those men that lived in the early 20th century and before. You know, it's funny. People of today, they tend to think of people from the past as being dumb, uneducated hicks. But that just wasn't the case. I mean, yeah, most of them couldn't do calculus or quote Aristotle, but they understood women a hell of a lot better than most men today do. For example, they knew that women were not equal, and that they were also not adults, not like men are. They also knew that you had to be your woman's guardian and take care of her, like a child, or a mentally retarded kid. Now, yeah, some retards grow up and transition into functioning adults, at least for the purposes of taking care of themselves and living on their own. But if they are very retarded, they really can't do that. And they end up having to live with their parents forever. Now, of course, women are a bit more functional than a very retarded person on average. I'll grant you that. I mean, not too many fully grown women are living with their parents. No, because back then, women were seen as a burden, and their parents wanted to marry them off as quickly as possible so as to remove a useless mouth that contributed nothing. So, of course, they didn't live with their parents their whole lives. Instead, they would live with a man, their husband, who would become their guardian. You see, women needed a guardian, and they still do, really, because they were not and are not a man's equal. That was part of why they didn't work. Of course, you could argue that women do some jobs well, like nursing. However, I think they just gravitate toward those types of jobs, and that men could probably do them all better. I think this is true of most, if not all, jobs women are interested in. So unless you're talking about pouring coffee or typing a report, women generally make inferior employees when compared to men. Hence, employers wanted to hire men, not women, as men were far more productive, and still are, by the way, which in turn allowed their employers to be more competitive in the marketplace, which would still be true today if this were the case. So yes, it is true that women in the 19th century and before, and the early 20th century, except in rare instances, were not career women. They didn't work. They didn't have to. And honestly, men did not want them to, because men knew a woman's limitations. And here's a woman's limitations. She was limited to being good at cooking, cleaning, making babies, and being stupid enough to complain about having everything taken care of for her. That was all a woman was really good for. And occasional sex. Because men did, and still do, everything better. I mean, yeah, you can hire a woman, and she can do a job, but she won't do it nearly as well as a man. So why would you hire a woman in the first place? Instead, you will reward, i.e. the woman, of your husband, and he took care of you. Simple. And for the most part, that was how it should have been. And it should have stayed that way. Because men back then knew that women made bad decisions. They made emotional and thoughtless decisions without any consideration of the consequences, except for how it benefited them. Just like a kid. And men knew that women, if given a man's power, would just run amok and make a mess of things, just like kids do if they're not supervised. That's part of why women don't feel they are accountable for their actions. They're like little kids, and little kids rarely, if ever, take responsibility for their actions. It is always someone else's fault, of course. It is also today's men that have a hard time holding women to account for their actions. You see, that's why a woman, when arrested and tried for the same crime as a man, will generally speaking get half the jail time that a man gets. The reason for that is that men, they still tend to view women as being less culpable for their actions than men. This is partly why women didn't own much land in the past, or if they did, it would become their husbands if they got married. Because men didn't want women being able to use property to gain some kind of foothold in political matters of the day, and also because women were seen as poor decision makers. For the most part, that's true. Just look around you at society today and tell me women are doing a good job running things. And by the way, don't fool yourself into thinking that men are in charge. Male politicians are being told what to do by special interest groups and by women because they want to get reelected and keep their jobs. There are more women than men, so there's more female voters than men. It's really that simple. Now, the left has spread this image of old American men and old America as being hell. That women were nothing more than indentured servants, and men tortured them with the hot pokers and pitchforks day and night, while forcing them to have 20 babies and beating them if they did a bad job cooking dinner or didn't sew the hole up in his favorite socks. They portray old world men as capricious monsters who abused their women and treated them like shite. But this just isn't true. Okay, yes, in many cases, women could not own property per se because they would make bad decisions with it and either not use it well, not do anything of value with it, or use it to try and gain, say, political power or some kind of power in society. That was the main problem, that women owning land would enfranchise them and give them more power in the day-to-day goings-on of society, which would have been a bad thing for society. You could also make the argument that men, at least in part, wanted to control their women to a certain extent. And that's not so bad a thing, really, if you ask me. Because the truth is, women need to be controlled to a certain extent. Just like your kids need to be controlled to a certain extent. They need boundaries and rules. Otherwise, they go crazy and do crazy shit. Like voting for the wrong people, for example. Just look at the majority of kooks and nuts that are in public office nowadays. Kooks like Maxine Waters and Nancy Pelosi. They're both clearly mentally ill nut jobs, and Maxine Waters is out of her mind. And these are the types of people women and feminists vote for. Just look at what has happened to our society. It's a disaster. People running around howling about safe spaces and trigger warnings, and men are now hated. Even though we do most of the work and nearly all of the work that builds and maintains society. We make the best decisions, yet we are relegated to being backseat drivers at best, all for actually doing, in the past, what was best for society. And by the way, oppression had and has nothing to do with it. Men were not looking to oppress women, and we're not looking to oppress women now. No one wanted to or did oppress them, just like no one wants to or does want to oppress little kids. Do you understand? Having some control of your kids is not a bad thing, and having some control over your wife is not a bad thing either. And yes, you might disagree and say that women are not kids, but just look at what has happened to our world. Look at how women act and the decisions that they make, and then tell me that again with a straight face. You know, it's really hard for us men. It's hard for us to balance what rights a woman should have and square that with the damage that they can do when they're given rights and power. It's hard to square that with what they can and do to society if you give them power and influence. It's very hard to balance what rights they have with what is best for society as a whole. I mean, in the end, you have to go with what's best for society, don't you? And boy, oh, did men more than a century ago understand that. Hell, even men in the 1940s and 50s understood that a woman's place was in the home and not out in the workforce. Hence, feminism, of course, had to attack yet again in the late 50s and 60s to try and break apart society in the form of so-called second-wave feminism. Because giving women the right to vote just hadn't been enough. Wasn't enough. No, women needed more power, and they needed more influence. Giving them the right to vote? Nah, we didn't go far enough. And by the left's estimation, not enough women were out in the workforce. Yeah, the left figured women, they were just too dumb to realize that their lives sucked and weren't great. Women needed to be woken up to the fact that their lives were a disaster. Being at home, having it easy, not having any problems. Oh, that's so horrible. You have it so bad, you just don't realize it. Well, let us inform you how bad you have it. And once we've done that, we can push you to get out into society more and get away from your evil husbands. Husbands who still did a pretty good job of keeping women and their irresponsibility in check. That being the case, women needed to get out into society more, alongside men, working alongside men. And they had to get out from under the influence of their evil husbands. But women fuck up society when you give them power of any kind. They work off of feelings and subjective evidence, which is no evidence at all, really. And instead, they just do whatever feels good for them. Sound familiar? It sounds just like children. And men in the early 20th century and before that understood that. The only reason modern men don't is because they watch too much fucking TV. Shows like that Dr. Quinn Medicine Woman, for example. That piece of crap was nothing more than feminist propaganda. Now, yes, historically speaking, there were some few rare women doctors back then, but they had a hell of a time operating and making a living of any kind. And they were not portraits of women as a whole. They were nothing more than outliers, extreme exceptions to the rule. Yet women like to hold such women up and say, oh, we can all do that. No, you can't. You're like a fucking child. This woman you're worshiping just happened to have gotten an extra squirt of testosterone while she was in the womb at a fairly important time in her development, and thereby ended up possessing more male traits in addition to her female ones. So it's really masculinity that you're worshiping and not femininity. And it is masculinity that you, women as a whole, don't have. That's the case with most women that actually did succeed in what was a male-dominated world back then. They simply did so because they possessed enough masculine traits. That's just biology. Biology that, by the way, doesn't exist within most women. And those types of women, they did exist in the old world. And they were called spinsters, as no man wanted to marry them. And for very good reason, by the way. So that society as a whole did not want to encourage women to be like that. Nor should they have. Because those women were rare exceptions. They were not the rule. Because it was understood that they were outliers, and that if society encouraged all women to be that way, the society would fail, and it would be a disaster. And just look at things now. Society is failing, and the only thing holding it together is money stolen from men and a printing press operated by boobs who think that the party will last forever. All thanks to women being allowed to vote and being given a hand in political power, a domain they should not be involved with in the first place. And men used to understand this because men were men. They ran the house and made all the decisions. And that was it, because it was well known that that was the best way. And we had small government. Before women got the right to vote, it was never more than 3% of GDP, except for when we had a war, of course. Only after they got the right to vote did it start to grow, that being government. Did government start to grow out of control? Because women, they always vote for what feels good, and they don't consider the consequences. Now, in the past, men knew that all too well. You know, men today think of things in very black and white terms. For example, they just automatically think women should have all the same rights as men, and they don't even question it. Not at all. And they think any men that are against women not having the right to vote, they think any men that are against women having the right to vote are somehow male chauvinist pigs that hate women and want them to be servile to men because we men want to be in charge. But by and large, that really isn't the case, and it never was. You see, men in the past kept women in their place, as it were, because that was what was best for society. Not just for men alone. Men didn't keep women in their place just because they wanted to be in charge. It was all about men. It was all about their egos. No, they knew that was what was best for society. Men have always been the gatekeepers of society, the guardians of it. While women, they ensured it lived on by having kids. But men protected and ensured its survival. That is the natural order of things. On the other hand, it is not a woman's job to do any of these things because they make shitty men and shitty workers on average as well. Rarely are they even as productive as men, or God forbid more so. And that's fine. All you need to do is have only men working. Society would be more productive if that was the case. And you wouldn't need as many jobs because men would get the same amount done with less workers needed to do it. And those jobs, they'd all pay more. And men would be able to operate the household without the need for his wife to work. Or God forbid, vote. Men in the past understood these things. They knew that women were not great workers, or even very good workers in most cases. Sure, there were exceptions, but for the most part, they sucked. So they stayed at home and raised kids, while the man worked. That was what was most practical, not only for the family, but for society as a whole. After all, the man was far better at making decisions, and he did the best job running things. So only he could and should be able to vote. It wasn't about keeping women down or subservient. It was about keeping them in check so that they didn't run amok and fuck up society. So yeah, men in the past couldn't do advanced math in most cases, and many could barely read, if at all, but they understood women. They understood that they were nothing more than small children in adult bodies, and that if given the chance, they would want their goodies to the detriment of everyone else. That being understood, they knew that at all cost, women should never be given power. And by the way, the only reason they were ever given power in the first place was because government, as it often does, wanted to grow. And the idea of a central bank had reared its ugly head yet again, and Congress and the elite global bankers who owned them knew that the American people, meaning men, would never go for another reserve bank being started. Such had been tried before. And men knew all too well what a disaster a reserve bank was for the country. But women didn't know. They knew shite about politics. And they still don't know anything about politics. All women saw was power and a chance to elevate themselves. You see, even if someone's situation is good, any chance they might get to make things even better will always be latched onto. Of course, that's human nature. Human beings are in the end self-serving creatures. And this is even more true when speaking of women. And so began the fall of the West. It was really that simple. All it took was giving women the right to vote, and that was it. The end. It's not so different than giving a 7-year-old the right to vote and telling him or her to vote his conscience. Of course, he or she is just going to vote for whatever is best for them in that moment. Now, fast forward to today, and you have the same thing. Feelings over facts. Facts or feelings, yada, yada, yada. Now, I know, as modern men, it's hard to square the idea of fairness and inalienable rights with disenfranchising an entire sex. They breathe, they move, they're human, so they should have all the same rights as men, right? But what if, in giving them those rights, you destroy the world? Would you still do it? Would you still support it? That's something men, even 110 years ago, understood. They understood that a bleeding heart will leave the world of men dead of blood loss. And when I say the world of men, I mean all of us. Men are simply the best representatives of mankind. And now look at us. We live in a world that's ruled by women, and it's a nightmare. Do you support that? People like to say that men have progressed. Some men like to say this with pride, that men have progressed in their views and their attitudes. Really? I think not, because I don't call these changes progress. Changes that impart a false view of the world and how it works best? No. I think, if anything, men have become dumb in how they view women and the world, and they need to not progress, but regress back to how they viewed women in the 19th century, when men saw women for what they were, good for making babies and making my sandwiches. Men, you really need to wake up and start squaring within your own heads what is more important. Is it more important to be fair and just and feel good about everyone being equal under the law? Or is it more important to be concerned about the world surviving? Because a fair world cannot survive, because life is not fair and never has been fair. Men a century ago, they understood this, and we need to regain that understanding before it's too late, which it might already be. I am the MGTOW philosopher, and I wish you well. Take care.